For decades, historians believed they understood Babylon. They believed its greatness was about size, wealth, and power. Then excavations went deeper. Beneath the streets, beneath the walls, researchers found systems that should not have been there. They were not symbolic, they were not accidental, they worked together. What was uncovered does not just add details to history, it directly challenges how human progress has been explained for generations.
The historical story everyone was taught. Long before archaeologists uncovered anything beneath Babylon, a clear story about human history was already accepted as truth. This story said that human progress moved slowly and in one direction only. First came stone tools, then simple metal tools. Much later came science, machines, and complex systems. According to this view, every major breakthrough happened once and stayed forever. Knowledge was believed to only move forward, never backward. Within this model, ancient societies were praised mainly for their labor, not for their thinking. Historians assumed that ancient builders followed inherited methods rather than understanding why those methods worked. When large buildings were constructed, the success was explained as the result of many workers, strict organization, and long experience, not careful calculation or technical planning. The buildings themselves were admired, but the people who made them were not credited with knowing the principles that made those structures stable and functional. This way of thinking placed human intelligence in very specific periods of history. Ancient Greece was presented as the moment when people first began to think logically and systematically. Rome was described as a society that applied those ideas through law, engineering, and administration. Civilizations that existed before Greece were not treated as sources of new ideas. They were described as early stages that only prepared the ground for later achievements. Societies outside this path were often reduced to roles as providers of labor, resources, or simple techniques, rather than creators of original knowledge. Over time, this ranking became so familiar that it was accepted without question and used as the default framework for studying the ancient world. Because of this framework, ancient technology was interpreted in a very narrow way. If an object looked complex, historians often assumed the people who made it did not understand how it worked. They were said to have arrived at solutions by repeated trial, copying earlier examples without knowing the reasons behind them. Another belief followed naturally from this. Complexity was linked to modern science. Precision was linked to written mathematics. If a society did not leave behind formulas, diagrams, or formal texts, it was assumed they could not plan with accuracy. If written explanations were missing, understanding was assumed to be missing as well. The lack of familiar evidence was treated as proof that advanced thinking did not exist. Archaeological practice adjusted to protect this model. When tools were found that did not match the expected level of technology, they were often labeled ceremonial objects. If a tool could not be easily explained as practical, it was described as religious. If a structure showed unusual precision, it was called symbolic rather than functional. These labels allowed researchers to avoid changing the larger timeline. This approach also left no room for loss of knowledge. Societal collapse was explained through war, famine, or politics, but not through the disappearance of technical understanding. The idea that a civilization could master certain skills and later forget them was rarely considered. Progress was treated as permanent, even when ruins suggested otherwise. Babylon was interpreted through this same lens for decades. Archaeologists studied its size, its walls, and its myths. They described its power and wealth, but its people were still seen as rulers and laborers, not engineers or system builders. The assumption was already fixed before deeper evidence came to light. Once this model was fully accepted, anything that contradicted it was not allowed to reshape history. It was marked as an exception, explained away, and placed at the edges of discussion where it could not threaten the story itself.
As excavations expanded in the 19th century, archaeologists began encountering objects that did not sit comfortably within accepted timelines. These were not dramatic discoveries announced with fanfare. They were small, technical, and often inconvenient. A tool that seemed too precise, a surface cut too cleanly, a material used in a way that appeared unnecessary for a so-called simple society. Drill holes cut into diorite, one of the hardest stones known, showed levels of precision that normally require tools harder than bronze. Yet these holes appeared in layers dated to periods before iron tools were believed to exist. At first, these finds did not cause alarm. They caused irritation. According to excavation reports from that period, many of these objects were documented carefully and then set aside. They were described in footnotes, appendix pages, or separate papers that never changed the main story. The reasoning was simple. One strange object could always be explained away. It could be an import from a later period. It could be contamination from a higher layer. It could be a misinterpretation by the excavator. The timeline itself was not questioned. When dates did not align, dating was blamed. Stratigraphy was said to be disturbed. Layers were described as mixed. The idea that ancient people might have been more capable than assumed was rarely considered. It felt safer to assume an error in measurement than an error in history. This approach became common practice. It kept the larger framework stable. What began to change was not the nature of the finds, but their number. Reports from different regions started showing similar problems. In one place, tools appeared too advanced for their layer. In another, construction methods seemed unnecessarily precise. Elsewhere, materials were used in ways that did not match their supposed purpose. Each case was treated separately, but together they formed a pattern that became harder to ignore. The real problem was repetition. When the same type of anomaly appears once, it can be dismissed. When it appears again, it raises questions. When it appears across multiple sites, cultures, and decades of excavation, it becomes uncomfortable. The mistake explanation begins to lose strength. It does not collapse, but it weakens. No single discovery forced a crisis. There was no moment when the academic world stopped and admitted something was wrong. Instead, tension built slowly. Some researchers began to express concern in private letters and conference discussions. Others published cautious papers that asked narrow questions without challenging the full model. There was hesitation, not rebellion. Curiosity mixed with worry. This discomfort was visible in how language changed. Words like unusual, puzzling, or unexpected began appearing more often in reports. Explanations became longer and more complex. Simple answers were no longer enough. Still, the overall structure of history remained untouched. The anomalies were treated as noise around a stable signal. As more data accumulated, attention began to shift. Researchers noticed that a large number of these unresolved finds came from the same broad region. Mesopotamia stood out not because it produced the strangest single object, but because it produced many small problems that refused to disappear. Tools, materials, and construction details from different sites raised similar questions. This clustering did not yet provide answers, but it changed the mood. The issue was no longer about isolated mistakes. It was about a region whose material culture did not fully match the expectations placed on it. That realization did not overturn history, but it prepared the ground for something more serious. That clustering becomes impossible to ignore once attention turns fully to Mesopotamia and one small object found near Baghdad.
As researchers began looking beyond isolated discoveries and started comparing patterns across regions, attention settled on a small object from the heart of ancient Mesopotamia. It came from the same river system, the same trade routes, and the same technical world that Babylon once dominated. Today, the find is referenced by the nearest modern city, Baghdad, but its origins belong to the wider Mesopotamian landscape where Babylon rose to power. The object is commonly known as the Baghdad Battery. At first glance, it looks unremarkable. It is a small clay vessel with no decoration and no obvious purpose. What drew attention was not how it looked, but how it was built. Inside the vessel sat a copper tube. At the center was an iron rod. The two metals were kept apart. The opening at the top had been sealed. This internal structure was the real surprise. According to excavation records, the placement of the copper and iron was precise. They were not simply dropped inside. They were positioned deliberately to avoid contact. Copper and iron are known to react differently when exposed to certain liquids. Some researchers later suggested that if an acidic substance had been placed inside the vessel, it could trigger a chemical reaction. This reaction would not power lamps or machines, but it could produce a small and measurable electrical charge. No serious researchers claims that ancient Mesopotamians used electricity the way we do today. There is no evidence of powered machines or lighting. What some researchers suggest is much narrower. They believe the vessel could have been used to create a small, controlled reaction for specific tasks. One possible use is coating metals. Another is treating surfaces. These ideas are debated, but they come from the way the vessel is constructed. They are not guesses added later to make the object sound impressive. What makes the vessel difficult to dismiss is that it only works if several conditions are met. The metals must be arranged correctly. The liquid must have the right properties. The vessel must be sealed. If any of these elements are missing, nothing happens. This level of precision does not support the idea of random assembly. A ritual object does not need internal rules to function. This object does. Here is where discomfort enters the story. If the vessel was used for a practical purpose, then someone had to understand what it did. They may not have had equations or written theory, but they understood cause and effect.
They knew that combining certain materials in a specific way produced a reliable outcome. That knowledge does not come from belief or superstition. It comes from testing. The vessel's significance extends beyond its construction. Electrochemical knowledge is traditionally traced to Luigi Galvani's experiments in 1790. If this vessel functioned as some researchers suggest, it demonstrates practical understanding of chemical reactions nearly 2,000 years earlier than previously thought. That gap does not adjust history slightly. It breaks the timeline that places experimental science exclusively in the modern world. The clay vessel matters because it fits into that pattern. It does not stand alone. It suggests that some craftsmen were not guessing. They were paying attention to results and changing their methods when those results changed. The object does not prove advanced science. It shows something simpler and more important. Ancient people were not always moving forward by accident. Once that idea settles in, the focus shifts on its own. The question stops being about one object. It turns toward everything else that was built, shaped, and arranged with the same kind of control.
When excavators working beneath the Southern Palace broke through ancient foundations, they expected bedrock. Instead, they found hollow spaces, deliberate voids beneath the structure. Below those were networks of clay pipes sealed with bitumen running in planned directions. Beneath streets, courtyards, and buildings, archaeologists began uncovering these systems. They were not loose fragments or broken channels. They were laid deliberately, following clear paths beneath walls and floors. The discovery was unsettling because these systems were not visible from above. They were built to work, not to be seen. The pipes were made from fired clay and joined with unusual care. According to excavation reports, the joints were sealed tightly using natural compounds. The seals were strong enough to prevent leaks even when water moved through the system with force. The bitumen sealant contained crushed limestone and plant fiber additives, a composite mixture that increased both flexibility and waterproofing strength. This detail matters. Simple drainage does not require pressure-resistant joints. Open channels or shallow ditches would have been enough. These pipes were designed for something more controlled. Researchers noted that the pipes were arranged in planned sequences. Water was not left to flow wherever gravity allowed. It was directed. It moved from one point to another through enclosed routes. Some pipes sloped gently. Others ran horizontally for long distances. This level of control suggests that the builders understood how water behaves and planned for it in advance. This was not improvisation during construction. It was design. This system also went beyond waste removal. Drainage systems usually carry water away from buildings. These pipes did more than that. Some led towards central areas, others connected to internal spaces. According to some interpretations, they could have supplied clean water as well as removed used water. This remains debated, but the layout itself shows that water movement was managed deliberately, not treated as a nuisance. What makes these systems even more striking is where they were found. They ran beneath foundations. They were embedded into the city at its earliest stages. Once buildings were complete, these pipes were no longer accessible. That means they had to be planned before construction began. A system like this cannot be added later without tearing structures apart. This alone points to long-term thinking. The fact that these systems were hidden is important. Decorative features are meant to be seen. Ritual structures are meant to be approached. These pipes were buried and sealed. Their value was purely practical. They existed to make daily life work better. This challenges the idea that ancient cities focused only on visible grandeur. Plumbing like this also changes how the city itself must be understood. A dense population cannot survive long without reliable water management. Standing water spreads disease. Waste buildup creates health problems. Controlled water systems reduce both. Even without modern knowledge of germs, the benefits would have been obvious through experience. Cleaner spaces last longer. Healthier people work better. Cities grow. Over time, archaeologists began to see these systems not as isolated features, but as part of a wider pattern. Roads, buildings, and underground systems appeared to support one another. This was not a city that grew randomly. It was shaped with purpose. Engineering was not added on top of the city, it was built into it from the beginning. Once systems like these were placed beneath the streets, their influence did not stop there. The same thinking soon appears inside homes and workshops, where control and planning shaped everyday life in even more surprising ways.